All righty. Welcome, everyone. Hopefully, everyone can see and hear me, or at least have something that will allow you to be engaged during this time. If you can, please feel free to put yes, I can see you, yes, I can hear you in the general chat. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Felicia. Thanks. I'm glad I look good. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Appreciate you all. Decided to wear yellow today to remind me that there are still beautiful things on this earth, even when it's super hard right now for many of us. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining She Geeks Out DEI virtual meetup. If this is your first time joining a She Geeks Out event, which I got to meet some of you all already, so excited you can join us, and we hope that this conversation is exactly what you're looking for. And if this is your 500th time joining us, whether you've done it in person or you've gone to our webinars or other meetups, thanks for coming again and always supporting us. So before I get started and talk a bit about who we are, I'd love to know who is in the space. I know some of you have already gotten a chance to chat while you were at the tables in different spaces. So would love for you all to just put in the chat who you are, what you do, and where you're calling in from. So as that is going, I'll start talking about what She Geeks Out is and what our meetup is and what that is all about. So She Geeks Out, we are a B Corp. And now we're remote, so it doesn't even matter where we're based at this point. And we work to create and promote diverse, equitable, and inclusive spaces. We do that through two ways. One way is through community events. So some of you have probably attended a lot of our community events that relate to people, women and allies who are in the tech spaces or tech adjacent spaces that are trying to figure out ways to do this work that feels good, right? And then another way we try to create and bring those space together is through our DEI trainings. So we do trainings for companies and organizations who are interested in bringing trainings about bias and equitable situations and policies. And obviously, another way we do this is through DEI work when we're doing our meetups and webinars. So this is something that you're joining now. We try to do our meetups monthly now, virtually. That might change, but because of the current situation that we're in now, we want to be able to still provide services and, most importantly, have conversations that need to be had. So you are in the right place today if you are wanting to talk about allyship, what that means, or if you probably use another term, we'll talk about that a bit as well. And what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean? And how do we sort of bring those two together? And how do we do better, right? Because if we're in the space practicing DEI work and also advocating for DEI work, we want to make sure that the field is doing a good job in what it's supposed to do. So that's a little bit about SGO and a little bit about what this meetup will be about today. I want to just do a quick housekeeping so everyone knows what's happening. Love the intros that's happening. So shouts to everyone that's doing that. With this platform, if this is your first time using it, you should be able to see me right now on your screen. There is a general chat section. So on your right-hand side, you are more than welcome to give comments, thoughts, feelings, reactions. That is what the chat box is for. If you look closely right next to the chat, you'll see participants at the top. You'll get to see all the people that are here. So if you needed to privately message someone because maybe sorry, but I mistakenly kicked you out too soon and you were having a really great conversation with someone, all hope is not lost. You can feel free to message that person and exchange information that way. And then as we're having the conversation today, we're going to invite you all to ask questions. So we want to make sure that the questions don't get lost in the chat box. So please, if you have any questions for me or the panelists as we're having this conversation, you are more than welcome to enter your questions in the Q&A. So we have questions there that are probably from a while ago, which is, what is your favorite ice cream and what's the last book you read? I'm just going to hit those as answered, but I just wanted to give you an example of what those questions look like when they pop up. If you, by any chance, see someone put a question that you also think is a great question and you have that same question, you can upvote it, right? So by clicking the small little triangle at the top, it'll allow for that question to move up. And so if a lot of people have the same question, that's the first question that I will post to the panelists so that they can answer that. And that's how the format will work. We're going to give about 25 to 30 minutes for myself and the panelists to have a discussion. And then right after, we'll open it up for another 15 to 20 minutes to answer whatever questions you might have put in the Q&A box. From there, we'll also have time at the end to continue mingling and networking. We know that virtual fatigue is real, so you do not have to stay. But if you want to continue networking, we invite you to do so, and we're providing the platform for you to do so. All righty. I think I mentioned everything Felicia is one of our co-founders and co-CEO of She Geeks Out. She's also a guest speaker, so I'm trying to remember everything. But Felicia, if I forgot anything, feel free to put it in the chat box. So,
Oh,
awesome. Yes.
I took that opportunity just to join you on the virtual stage. You are
Yay.
doing great. I think we covered everything, but you know what? Like one of our big favorite things to say with SGO is embrace your awkward. So we're just
Yes.
rolling with it. If we forgot something, we'll make sure to make up for it later. But continue on, Fatima.
I appreciate you for jumping in. That is Felicia. You will get to see her in the next like couple minutes. So thank you for jumping in and just saying that. I appreciate that. So before I introduce the guest, there's a question that we ask now because I don't want to pretend that there aren't hard things happening, right? Besides COVID, there's recent events that we keep coming into contact with as it relates to killings and deaths of people, right? And I want to name that and hold space for that. And at the same time, want to bring that into the conversation because it's very connected to DEI work and being an ally or a co-conspirator or accomplice, whatever word you choose, right? So I want to hold that. And maybe, you know, in our last meeting, Felicia led us in a silence activity, just a moment of silence. So I want us to just do about 10 to 15 seconds, and I'll tell us when to come back, just to silently just reflect on what's happening right now in our society and to pay homage to people who are no longer with us and have unfortunately lost their lives to brutal and unfortunate events. Thank you all so much for participating in that. If you did participate, and please feel free to bring questions and thoughts around any of what I just mentioned. As I'm about to introduce our amazing panelists, I invite you to do one thing again in that chat box, something that a friend recently shared with me. Her name is Brenda. She shared with me an activity, a prompt, and the prompt is, what is your internal weather? And when she first shared this with me, I said, say more. And basically, because we're in such a different time, and some of this isn't different, this is something that's been happening for many people for a very long time. So I want to be very clear on that. But how are you showing up into this space today? Right. And that's what I mean by what is your internal weather. So an example of internal weather would be I feel sunny, meaning like I feel good. I'm okay to be here. Rainy, maybe it's not so good. Or maybe you're feeling cloudy or maybe stormy, windy, whatever your internal weather is right now. And those are just a few examples. I want you to put that in a chat box so we know how we're showing up into this space today. And as you're doing that, I'll take a moment to transition over to start introducing our panelists. So thank you, Felicia, for kicking us off. Yeah, storms are definitely on the horizon. This morning, it was a bit hard for me to get up. I also took a moment to just be at peace with my emotions and not try to rush from the storm and getting to the sun, right? And so recognizing that it's okay to feel how you feel at this moment. Thank you all so much for sharing that. All righty. So you're probably going to hear a beeping sound right now. I think there's something that my roommate is making, so we're embracing the imperfection of what's happening, as Felicia said, the awkwardness. So forgive me for that. So our first panelist, who you just saw, her name is Felicia Jad Zak. She is the co-CEO and co-founder at She Geeks Out. Felicia has her MBA, and she's also the head of training at She Geeks Out. So I get to work really closely with Felicia, and it's truly been a joy. She worked in the technology industry for over 10 years, specializing in the creation and development of innovative programs and solutions. She has extensive experience in providing strategic guidance for diversity and inclusion across cross-functional teams. And in 2016, she pivoted to focus solely on She Geeks Out. Felicia runs sales and business development, is the lead diversity and inclusion facilitator, and works on strategy and corporate programming on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Felicia is also the product of an entrepreneurial family and continues that tradition with her work at She Geeks Out. when Felicia is not doing this, she loves street art, and I've got to see her Instagram page. It's really, really cool. She also likes fitness and wellness, wine, and French fries. So if you have some of the same feels as Felicia, feel free to comment. Oh, our other co-CEOs online. Hi, Rachel. So yeah, that's the first panelist. The second panelist, her name is Candice Belanov. She's associate professor, Boston University School of Public Health, who I've had the pleasure of working with, being in her classroom and doing all the things with her. She has her SCD, MPH, is in the maternal and child health epidemiologist with the particular interest in the relationship of social forces and inequities to patterns of population health. She is currently investigating associations between area level disadvantage, its distribution by race and ethnicity, and the occurrence of preterm birth, low birth weight, and other adverse perinatal outcomes. Recent research has also addressed health outcomes related to cesarean delivery, substance use among women of reproductive age, and health outcomes related to assisted reproductive technology. In addition to everything public health, Candice also loves music, yoga, politics, dogs, her family, and friends. So I'm glad that Candice will be joining us today. And our last panelist is Jess Lee. Jess Lee is currently the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Director at City Year Boston. She also has her MBA. So these people are going to be bringing out so many different ways and backgrounds to have this conversation today. Jess is passionate about education equity, the role service plays in affecting change, and ensuring that people feel respected and heard in their workplace. At City Year, Jess leads diversity, belonging, inclusion, and equity training while focusing on creating policies that ensure equity across lines of difference. Before joining City Year in 2019, Jess worked at East Harlem Tutorial Program, leading racial equity work and volunteer management at development for over 400 yearly volunteers. Wow. Outside of work, Jess is an avid reader. Listen, y'all, she reads 115 plus books a year. I know. And she's a theater geek who loves hiking on the weekends with her husband and toddler. So I am in full gratitude with all the people that are joining us today, because you could be doing so many things right now, but our panelists decided to join us. And before I bring them to the stage, because that's what we're going to call this tonight, I'm going to start us off by showing a really short clip of a really long video. And the reason why I'm doing that is because some of the terms in the title of this event mean so many things to many of us. And I just want us to know that we, in this moment, have the opportunity to really expand on these concepts and have a deep conversation. So I'm going to play this video. It's about 2.5 minutes. We'll watch it, and then I'll bring the panelists on stage and we'll get started. All right. So I see all the love that's happening right now in the chat box. I appreciate y'all. And I hope that we continue to engage in this way. So as I'm getting my screen ready to share with you, please feel free to continue chatting and connecting with one another. All righty. All right. So it will pop up sooner than later. I'm going to take myself off camera so you have a full view. I'm going to turn my mic off and be back on. All right, I think I've gotten a report that I have to turn my mic on. So we're going to try it again, and hopefully it works. And if not, I will be more than happy to give you an overview of what Dr. Bettina Love talks about in this video. All right, that is totally fine. I'm going to go ahead and X this out, but I will put the link to this video in case you want to watch it later and come back online. Yeah, it worked for us a few days ago, but maybe today Remo isn't trying to do that with us. So that's totally fine. Technology is our best friend and sometimes teaches us to keep it moving. So I appreciate you going with the flow. So in that short clip, before I get the panelists on board, Dr. Bettina Love, who is an amazing person. She's an award-winning author and associate professor of educational theory and practice at the University of Georgia. And in that video, she talks about what it means to be an ally and what it means to be a co-conspirator. And what she does is she brings the story of someone, and you all should probably know the story, of the person who takes the flag down in North Carolina, a Black woman, and she talks about how it was very important for people to be co-conspirators in that moment because being an ally just wasn't enough. And she goes as far as to say that they knew that they needed a Black woman to bring that flag down in North Carolina, right? And so because of that, they needed a white man to help this person. And that meant teaching her how to climb. That meant standing by the pole. So when police officers wanted to tase the pole, that they would have to tase this man as well. And that's what allowed this work to move forward. And so I wanted to bring that perspective into the room today because we're going to really talk about what allyship means to us. And we might not even use that term as many of us use various terms. So I'm going to invite Felicia to the stage, and Jess, you should be able to come to the stage now, and also Candice, so we can get a look at you all and then also get your reaction for some things. Awesome. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Yes. Welcome. I hear an echo. Do you all hear an echo?
No, I'm not. I don't.
Okay, I'll keep talking. And then the chat, feel free to let us know if you are having any issues hearing us clearly. Okay, Allison's saying she's hearing the echo as well. Rachel said we sound good. Technology is just playing games with us today. I'm already sweating.
Well, maybe what we can do is if we're not actually speaking, we'll just put ourselves on mute and then we can unmute as we need to.
Great idea. Awesome. And with that idea, if you continue to hear an echo, everyone, please let us know. So Candice, Jess, and Felicia, I know you all had an opportunity to watch that small clip that I wanted to show to everyone. So with you all, now that you're here, what is your understanding of allyship? And feel free to react to that video as well. From each of your perspectives, how would you define allyship, or maybe another term that you're more comfortable using? So happy to start off with Candice, Jess, and then Felicia.
First of all, thanks for having me here. I feel really honored and almost a little mystified. But I also want to shout out to Fatima, who is possibly one of my very favorite students ever, and now my very much valued colleague. But you know, I've definitely encouraged myself and others around me to veer away from the allyship ideal, or at least to distinguish it from accomplished, just for the reasons that that video highlights. Which is, you know, we can't just pat ourselves on the back and say, well, I'm not an active racist, so I'm okay, you know, or I'm not going to oppose what you're doing. I'm not going to stop you from taking down that flag, so I'm okay, right? I'm okay with you. And I think that's a great, it's just you know, what she highlights is such a great, perfect example of what it means to actually help the work advance and to put your body literally on the line to do that. And so few people are willing to do that, myself included. I mean, I'm like, I've never been in a fight before, which I don't know, maybe I need to like do something about that just so I'm like not so, but I'm like, you know, pretty conflict averse and definitely physically not, you know, I've never taken a swing at anything really. So anyway, all to say that it's, you know, it's not my nature to sort of throw my body on the line necessarily. And yet, you know, historically and in current day, sometimes that's what it takes, or at least it means, you know, if not putting your body on the line, putting your reputation on the line, or putting your job on the line, or putting whatever it is that you have to lose on the line. And And I think it's, you know, the more people who do it, you know, many hands make light work. But, you know, if I'm going to be real and honest, like that's, you know, it's something I wrestle with quite a bit, being where I'm coming from as, you know, a professor in a, you know, traditionally historically white institution with a lot of hierarchical structure and benefiting handsomely from that privilege of participating in that. Like, you know, what does it mean? I know maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyway, I'm going to stop ranting because I could go on. But anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to Joe Biden this and be like, I'm out.
That is totally fine. If you probably already know, some of you might know Candice, like, because I see some participants who know Candice. Yes, we'll hear from you, Candice, and you don't have to say everything right now. And I'd love to hear your perspective of the privileges. Thank you so much for sharing. Jess, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for having me, Fatima. I also just want to highlight that I have a toddler who definitely knows how to open doors. So if a small 3-year-old walks by, just say, "Hey, Charlie," and be good with it. So, I mean, I think for me, I struggle with the word ally or allyship because, as Candice was saying, it feels passive. It feels like something that you can do as a performance to pat yourself on the back, to, you know, share something on Facebook and that's it, right? And as a way to say, you know, I'm not something, I'm not a racist, I'm not homophobic, right? Without actually being anti-racism, anti-homophobia, and as a way to not actually take action or take risk. And so I struggle with it a lot. I think a lot about the ways that I've been an ally in not positive, you know, ways and haven't really pushed or put myself on the line for it. And I really love how Bettina Love shares that in the video and would highly recommend, you know, the kind of alternate options to being an ally and what are other kind of words or terms that you can use. I've heard accomplice, I've heard co-conspirator. I particularly like co-conspirator because I think it feels like you're then, you know, in the mud and weeds and, you know, gross stuff and negativity all together with someone. So you have a piece where you're owning your own learning, but then you're also actually using that learning and putting it towards action. And Brittany Packnett Cunningham has this really great post that she posted on Instagram, I think last week, talking about allyship. And she's like, let's graduate from allyship. And I really appreciate that because I think it's just taking that next step, right? Okay, cool, you're an ally, you've done some homework. Now what's the next step? And how are you actually going to take that homework and take the things that you've learned and actually put it into action?
I think we've lost Fatima, but in her absence, I will. And thank you for sharing, Jess, and Candice as well. I love what you both had to share about this. And to echo your comments for both of you, I think that I agree completely that there's this, or I should say there can be this understanding or this thought process that ally can be more passive. And so completely agree with you, Jess, that I think there needs to be this shift away from this passivity to more actionable approach to thinking about and being an ally. And one thing that we talk a lot about internally and with the work that we do around allyship and what that means, especially not necessarily just in the world, but in a corporate environment, is this idea that being an ally includes and incorporates standing up for others. And it's not just a performative action. So it's not just about getting like the gold star or putting the safety pin on your clothes or saying, hey, I'm an ally, like, great, you know, and then going on about your lives. There's more to it. It's putting yourself on the line, whether it's your body, your words, your reputation, your job. There's something that has to be at risk almost, because it's not always about getting that pat on that back and saying, great, like you're an ally, you know, good job for you, but that you're doing it anyway, even when there might not necessarily be a benefit in it for you. And you might actually be yourself harmed by whatever you're doing to act as an ally. And I was actually, well, I'm sure we'll get into this a bit more later on, but I attended this webinar earlier this week from Change Catalyst, and it featured Jennifer Brown of Jennifer Brown Consulting, who is a huge voice in the space. They were talking about allyship more from the lens of the LGBTQIA plus experience. And I just really loved what she had to say, which was the tax of being different shouldn't fall solely on people who are and show up different in whatever space you're looking at. And so that's part of the work that I see as an ally, is really showing up and being there, even when that being there is not necessarily going to be a good thing or give you something in return.
Thank you all so much for sharing. I guess I was like kicked out and came back in, so here we are. But I got everyone in all what you said. I think it's so interesting when we talk about language, because there was one time when I was doing this work and I posted on like social media, and I was like, we need a new term. Can somebody I need a new term. Some people feel like co-conspirator, accomplice sounds weird. Allyship isn't enough. And one of my professors was an African American woman. She was my professor back in undergrad, and she's in her 50s, and she said, I think that's exactly what the problem is. She was like, you all need to go out and do the work. You're so concerned about language and figuring out what the right word is, but what is the action that's being done? And that, even as me as someone, I was like, who are you talking to? Right? Like, I'm over here trying to help, but it really allowed me to put things in perspective, because for people who we're talking about being allies to, or co-conspirators to, or accomplices to, they're at a level of like what they need right now. They're not pressed or worried about what language we're using, right? It's like, how do you support, how do you show up, and how do you do this work? So I appreciate you sharing your thoughts, everyone. So with those definitions, we know that allyship is a word that a lot of us are moving away from, or trying to, if we do use it, be very explicit of what it should look like. The acronym DEI is another words that some of us have in our titles now, or have had in the past, that is something that we also question, like, what exactly is DEI and how should we be practicing it? So my next question for you is, what are some ways you've seen allyship practiced incorrectly in the DEI field, and why do you think that is? So I want to start off with Jess, then we'll have Felicia and Candice. You can finish us off.
Yeah, thank you. The amount of times that people ask me what DEI is, or spell it DIE, it's like such a struggle. So I appreciate you saying that. I mean, I think kind of using specific examples, I think a great example of allyship in my mind that can be performative is if, I'm having a conversation as a person of color, as a woman of color, as a Black person with a white person who says, oh, I've read White Fragility. And I'm like, okay, like, great. So it's this way of feeling like, oh, I got you. I know what you're talking about, without actually like putting the action forward. And I love what you said, Felicia, about doing the work, even though you might not get a pat in the back. And I think that's, where that true allyship or co-conspirators really lies. And I think, allyship in my mind, I think sometimes, and when it can be done incorrectly, is when it's done without actually listening. So you're not like listening to the folks who need to be centered in that conversation, or centered, they're the most impacted, the folks of non-dominant identities, most marginalized or most vulnerable. And you're actually just like putting yourself into this space as more important. And so I think a piece of taking that allyship to the next level is really sitting and listening and trying to figure out, like, how do I not center myself and actually center the folks who are most impacted by this?
Yeah, thank you. Such good points. I basically just want to like snap everything that everyone's saying so far. But I would say, in response to your question, Fatima, I'll share like a really quick story. I won't name the company, and that's a conscious choice I'm making. But I was on a panel a couple years ago where there was someone who had a DEI title, and we were talking about allyship and the same exact concept. And something that just really has always stuck with me was that this person who was in a role, who had some marginalized identities, was basically saying that if you work in a company and you also possess, you're from an underrepresented group, or you have a marginalized identity, it's your job to basically disclose that and show up. And that, I really took that the very wrong way, because I think that's exactly the opposite, right? Is that if you're really truly wanting to and hoping to act as an ally, you have to respect that there are many different other lived experiences out there, and people may choose to show up or not show up in a whole variety of different reasons. And I think one of the dangers that we all have in front of us, especially for those of us who sort of sit with these titles and these roles, and if we're working in this space and we're lucky enough to be able to be doing this work, is that, a lot of us do come to this conversation or to this work because we've had our own experiences and we have our own lived identities and our own lived experiences. And then I think the danger there is that if we forget that there are other ways of experiencing or being in the world. So for example, I look at a lot of what I do through the lens of disability because I identify as disabled. But just because I have a marginalized identity doesn't mean that I understand what someone else's experience might be. I might have a little bit to that approach or what might be going on, but it doesn't mean that I, at the core of who I am, know what it feels like to be someone from a different group. And I think that's that tension that we all have to live with, and that's where we can sometimes go off path a little bit when we're thinking about where might allyship not be represented or performed in a I don't want to say the correct way, but in the best possible way.
It's hard going last because everybody said everything's smart already. And I definitely want to emphasize something that Jess said, or just put a exclamation point next to it, is going in and not having your ears and eyes open and being receptive and going in with the sort of beginner's mind or as a learner and with a whole lot of humility is sort of dooming yourself to failure, I would say. Especially if you're coming from a privileged identity, going in, I mean, it's the white saviorism that everybody knows to sort of at least by definition avoid. It's still so, it's people in privileged identities have been so groomed and trained to believe that they really do have the answers. And if people would just, listen to us, we could show you how to, everything could be okay. Or we can show you how to do things better, from parenting to educating to whatever, right? And obviously that's not the case. I think one thing I would add to what's already been said is that from an institutional level, if you're going into this type of work, whether you're calling it DEI or whatever, if you're hoping that you can do the work but not have fundamental change to the institution and the power hierarchies, you're also kind of doomed to history at least just repeating itself, which is why I take issue with, and it's probably not my original thought, but if you think something for a long time, then you start to think it is your original thought. But that inclusion, suggests, I'm sure this was not my original thought because somebody way smarter than me came up with it. But inclusion suggests that there's something to which, we'll be doing you a favor if we include you in our awesome institution or party or group or whatever. And in fact, there's a guy revving a motorcycle. So I'm just like, oh my God, he's been doing it all day. There's like no mufflers in Mission Hill, Boston, apparently. But, or there's a muffler shortage, that and the toilet paper. But, to expect that you're not going to have to change the institution and give something up, I think is the first mistake of a lot of failed attempts at true equity building. Rev. Gosh.
Oh, that was the person agreeing with you. Totally fine, but I was able to hear you. And I just want to hone in to the points that you all just made, right? And the first point you made, Jess, was around this idea of knowledge, right? Where it's like everyone thinks they know everything because they've read something, right? And if you get to watch the video that I put in the link with Dr. Bettina Love, she talks about that, where she's like, sometimes specifically as it relates to race, the people who are considered allies are the ones that are reading up on everything. They've read the latest articles, their latest book, and then they're asking you as a Black person, to be like, did you read Ta-Nehisi Coates' latest book? And it's like, no, I didn't, because I was too busy being Black. But I'm grateful that you read that book. And what does it look like to sort of incorporate and actually embody and practice what you read from that book? So that knowledge piece is key. Felicia, your point about understanding someone's experience, we talk a lot about intent and impact. I think we keep flipping, and we like intent versus impact, intent and impact, trying to tell people that even if your intent is great or good, it does not necessarily mean that how it's going to land and how it's going to impact people is good, right? And so when we're talking about understanding people's experiences, that's what we mean, where a lot of people are saying like, I know exactly how you feel, but you don't. And that's okay. You can still do the work, right? And so being very careful about the language we use. And Candice, your point about savior complex, right? Whether it's around race, whether it's around gender, whether it's people being able-bodied, this idea that those of us with privileged identities are here to save people without privileged identities, and not realizing that them themselves also have power within, right? And so how do we make sure we bring everyone to the table as we're doing this work as DEI practitioners, as co-conspirators, and so forth? So thank you all for your comments. So my next question, we touched a little bit about this, but you all have various identities. Some of them are visual and some of them are not. Felicia, you mentioned, you know, identifying as someone who's disabled. So I want to talk about that, because when we talk about allyship, we also have to talk about the areas in which we have privilege and the areas that we don't have privilege, and how that impacts our positions and the way we show up in the world. So my first question is for you, Candice. As a white woman, as a professor, how do your identities show up in the DI space? For example, maybe how people perceive or interact with you. And because of that, how do you respond?
Great question. So clearly I have some like visual privileges. I am white. I grew up middle class, give or take. I identify as female, cisgender, give or take. There's a lot of things that had I not grown up in the 70s, that might have been different. But anyway, and my position as a professor is a really high prestige, even though I still shake my head and laugh, and anybody who knew me in college definitely shakes their heads and laugh. You know, it's such a position of power, and it's within a system and an industry that is absolutely about hierarchies. It's militaristic in a way, in that, you know, you advance, you get promoted to different ranks. They even call them ranks, and you are afforded a certain level of respect for being at a certain rank. It's supposed to reflect a certain, anyway, you get the picture. It's, you know, one thing that I really try to conscientiously and purposefully do is to try to put aside some of the trappings of that prestige and privilege, which is, I really insist that people call me by my first name, like across the board, which isn't such a big deal, right? We all have first names. We all grew up being that first name. And actually from a cultural standpoint, there are students who I teach who are really uncomfortable with that. And I don't force them to do it, of course, because in the schooling system that they were brought up in, like, that was just like weird. And sidebar story, at the first table that I sat at the beginning of all this, at the table sitting with me, I recognized one of the people there. It was my child's 9th grade biology teacher from the O'Brien School. Hi, Mr. Smith. I still want to call him Mr. Smith, because, like, you know, you call your teachers, your kids' teachers by their last name. Anyway, and that, you know, I can't get used to that otherwise. So I understand that. But anyway, trying to dismantle trying to purposefully and publicly take apart a little bit of that hierarchy in order to, and honestly, it's truly, I'm so humbled by the position that I'm in that it kind of makes me more comfortable too. I mean, part of it's for me and my own comfort level of operating in that system, but trying to say, hey, we don't have to operate this way. And, you know, I've learned way more from Fatima, I'm sure, than Fatima ever learned from me. Like, I'm okay with, like, owning that. Like, it's true. Keep your mic off. It's utterly true. And, you know, I think owning that publicly, I think being explicit about that, you know, that I'm here to learn as much as anybody in these classroom spaces. And the other thing I would say is that I think is important as a white person to do, and as a white person of a lot of social privilege, is to model for other white people that, and to own that this is our work, that dismantling racism should be primarily, we should be at the front lines of this. And I say those words in class often, like, this is our work. And I don't have just white people in my class, but I'll be like, you know what, this is, anyway. So I think being explicit about that, and it shocks some people to be sort of called out for, you know, or to have their work identified with their race, but it's definitely something I think that's important to flag and to demonstrate, although I don't do it very well most of the time, I would say.
For that, Candice, and I appreciate you talking about the various identities, right? Where it's like breaking down that hierarchy that usually exists, whether you're in the workplace as like a regular company or working in academia, there's a certain level of respect that people have for you because of the positions that you have, right? And people who might be at the lower end of that hierarchy aren't always given the same respect, or even when they walk into a room or share something, people hear them differently, right? There's a professor at School of Public Health that talks about white ears, where if I say something as a Black woman, it will land different. But if Candice says something, it might land a bit better because for some reason, and we know why the reasons are, people hear things better when people look like them. Right. And so I appreciate you sharing that and then talking about what whiteness plays in that as well. So Felicia, coming to you as a co-CEO of a small company doing big things, right? And while this is the case, I imagine you've had interesting experiences being a biracial woman, head of DEI at your company, and so many other things. So what are some opportunities and challenges that have come up for you?
Yeah, I would say that, so I shared that I am disabled, I'm biracial, and I think, my own identity has been something that I don't want to say struggled with, but definitely I'm constantly learning and evolving, as I think we all are, especially as collectively we have greater and deeper understanding in some of these areas. But in terms of my background, I am half white and half Indian, and my name is actually Polish, but I present as vaguely brown, as I like to say, or racially ambiguous. And so what I've sort of grown up with is always feeling like not quite part of any one particular group, where I wasn't white enough for my white side of the family. I wasn't Indian enough for the Indian side of the family. I don't speak Spanish. So when people come up to me on the street and they start speaking Portuguese or Spanish, I'm like, I don't know what you're saying to me. And so I've always felt a little bit outside or on the margins. And even with my identity as a disabled woman, I am hard of hearing. And so I'm not completely deaf, so I'm not deaf enough for the deaf community. So that's sort of my lens that I bring to the work. And honestly, I'll be really frank, when I was sort of earlier on, before I was in this position of being part of SGO and starting this company with my business partner Rachel, who's on the chat right now, I was working in tech, and I was working in spaces where it was predominantly white men who were in the room with me. There were very few people who look like me, very few women, very few people of color. And I didn't really hold my identities as part of who I was. It was something that I either didn't really think about or sort of put to the side, or was looking to actively cover or hide. And it wasn't until I want to say 2014, 2015, and I was on a panel just like this, or very similar to this one. And I was actually in your role, Fatima. I was moderating a panel. And one of the panelists looked around and she said, oh, what's so amazing is that every single person here is a woman of color. And it was true, but it was also really one of the very first times that I had someone apply that label to me. And I've gone off my video. I don't know why, but I'll just keep talking. Embracing the awkward. I'm going to just turn completely yellow now. And so while this is figuring itself out, I'm going to turn my video off so you don't have to look at this yellow square. But my point being is that it was a really interesting moment in my own sort of understanding of who I was, where I felt, okay, I am not completely white. I am not completely a lot of things, but I do have certain identities within myself. And so I think that this idea of where do we hold more privilege and where do we hold less privilege is something that's constantly evolving. When I worked in these different tech spaces, I didn't have a lot of privilege. I didn't have a fancy title. I didn't have a lot of influence. But now I'm a co-CEO, but what does that mean, right? And so there are spaces where that title will absolutely give me the access to those ears, as you were saying, access to the white ears or to whatever ears I'm trying to bend. And there are spaces where it still doesn't matter because I'm still a woman, or I'm still a short brown person, or I'm still whatever it might be. And so I think that, this idea, it's just something that I constantly am thinking about is, how does that evolve? Where do we hold more power and privilege? Where do we hold less? And what does that mean, even from the standpoint of how are we ourselves thinking about this internally, but also how are people outside of us looking at us, right? Because as I mentioned, You know, I sort of am this racially ambiguous person. So when I walk down the street here in the Boston area, people look at me and put me into a category that I may or may not fit into, but I have no control over that, right? I can't control how they see me, but they're looking at me through their own lenses. And that's something that I talk a lot about with my family, because my mother, who is Indian, doesn't understand that. It's not her lived experience. She comes at this from a really different point of view. And it's a real point of tension sometimes between her children, my siblings, and her, where we try to explain to her that even though she may not want something to be true, it doesn't take away the fact that society views us in a very particular way. And it doesn't matter that that way is right or wrong. It's the reality, right? And I do think that society overall, like there's so much more greater awareness and a lot of more language and discussion around these topics, but it doesn't mean that we fix it. It doesn't mean that we understand it. And it doesn't mean that even we as individuals who are in it completely know the whole of it, because I guarantee you that tomorrow, next week, next year, I'll have a different take on this question. So I'll pause for now, but it's such an important question. Thank you for bringing it up, Fatima.
Of course, and thanks for answering that and going with the flow, regardless of what technology you decided to do on the side. So we appreciate you for being able to do that. But there's so many things that you said, like, wow, right? Like we could continue unpacking that, but some things that I just wanted to point out was, you know, as I listened to Candice's, you know, experience of like the various identities and how she shows up and what that means and how people react to her and the work that she has to do, and then listening to your experiences and your identities, it's so key for us to really pay attention to what's happening here, right? Because some of us might be actual practitioners and we have that title. Some of us might be DI advocates, but it doesn't mean just because we have certain titles that we're able to move in the spaces in the same exact way, right? All of us can be in the same room, and if we decide to say the same exact thing, it might be taken differently. So it's really important as we continue to think about this field and how do we step up in the times when we know that I'm in the DI space, but I have privilege, right? I'm able-bodied, I'm white. I'm not talking about myself because I'm not white, but I'm able-bodied, or whatever other privilege identities you have, and you want to do this work. Really listening to what people are saying right now is so key. So I really wanted to say that, and I appreciate you being honest and vulnerable about even the identity of women of color, that label and what that meant and how that sort of shifted the way you view the world and how people view you. So I'm moving on to Jess, and after Jess, we have one more question. I know people were putting things in the Q&A, so we're going to go right straight to there because y'all have a lot of deep questions that we need to get to. So Jess, you have been leading DEI work at City Year, and before that, you were in spaces where many people did not look like you. In your experience, what does allyship look like when supporting a Black woman in your role? Like, I want you to just say what you got to say, right? Because yes, just take the mic.
Really?
Okay. Wait, no kidding.
So, I mean, I think something that comes up for me when thinking about this question is, you know, I've worked at City Year for a little over a year now, and City Year is a very interesting place. A lot of positives, some negatives, you know, kind of thrown in there like any other education nonprofit. But I think for me, what an ally or a co-conspirator looks like for me as a Black woman, a woman of color, is someone who will uplift the things that I am saying and put their voice out there as well. And so there's sometimes where I will say stuff over and over and over and over and over again, and it is either not taken or it's disregarded, or it's like, that's a great idea, but nothing's ever done. And I have there's a coalition of folks at City Year Boston who are also supporting and leading all of this, you know, equity work. And sometimes I'll shoot out a message and be like, I need someone else to say this because I've said it a million times. Or I'll say, I specifically need a white person to say this because I have said this a million times. And I think that is what I really need, is folks to kind of jump in there with me and say like, hey, this is actually unfair, or this is racist, or this is oppressive, or this is ableist, right? Because my voice gets really tired. And so it's someone who's also there kind of with me, you know, jumping in and doing this work and committing to actions to move this work forward. And so I think also about just the solidarity building that we're trying to build at City Year Boston and what it means to be people of color when this feels like such a vague, you know, wide term, broad term. and there's, you know, specific infighting within racial identities and ethnicities that's purposeful to continuing systemic oppression, right? So what does it mean for us to build solidarity? And so I try to think about, what does my solidarity look like for other folks? Where I have privilege, where I have the dominant identity, what does it look like for me to be in solidarity with LGBTQIA+ folks, right? Or folks who have disabilities? And then what does it look like for them to be in solidarity with me as a Black woman trying to lead this work? And so I try to always stay extremely reflective in making sure that what I'm asking of other people, I'm also willing to do myself.
Everything you just said, and I appreciate you sort of bringing us that perspective, because while we all have our various identities, we're not like the guru of like equity, right? We're, even with the identities that we have been marginalized in, we still have internalized racism, internalized sexism within us, right? So that's work that we also have to do. But in addition to that, there's work that we have to do as well to be in solidarity, as Jess said, with other folks. So thank you so much for sharing that and naming that, and saying that sometimes even in my role, people are not listening to me, right? So sometimes I got to tap people and be like, hey, I'm tagging you in, come on in, right? And it's important to be able to have that person, right? Do you have people in your corner, or a person in your corner who you can tap in, that can come in and say, hey, I got you? Or like the person that was near Bree Newsom on that poll that was like, if you tase this poll, you will not only tase her, you will also tase me, right? And so as we close out with our last question, 1 minute each so that we can get to the next one, is what should practitioners and advocates be doing to show up as co-conspirators, allies, accomplices, whatever term people are comfortable using? What should people be doing, especially now with our current crisis? I know, some of us are getting used to the fact that we are within a pandemic and it's still difficult, but I wanted to end with that because I know a lot of us might be thinking, like, what does it look like right now in our workplaces, in our communities, to be a co-conspirator and ally? So I want to kick us off. Felicia, you can kick us off, then Jess, and then Candice, you can close us out.
All right, and apologies for my snap camera kicking me out visually, but I'm back. 3 things that come to mind, I'll keep it brief. First is, how do we create space to have that psychological safety? And I think that in a virtual world, that creating space is going to look differently, right, than it might have if we were all in person. Second is model vulnerability. And like we were just talking about, there are places where we can show up and model that so that we create that space. And then third is just really simple, listen. I think listening is such a key piece of this. And sometimes where we fall off course is where we don't listen and we just aim to speak and respond without actually hearing.
Yes, I love all of that, Felicia. Ooh, magnificent. I think for me, it's there's a big piece around owning your own learning. Obviously, I'm a huge reader, so I highly recommend just a significant amount of books of owning your own learning, and making sure that you are continuing to build as much awareness as you can, because this is a very long journey, right? It's not going to be something that we're going to fix within ourselves in the short term. Something that I also just want to highlight is the benefits of therapy. And I've been trying to share this as much as possible. I am a newfound person who's found therapy because of the burden of all of this work, but also particularly found therapy because I wanted to have a Black woman therapist, and I could not find one. And I found one, and she's magnificent. And I think she helps to challenge the perfectionism that I have, the level of burden that I put on myself, while also making sure to push me in other ways, right? Making sure that I'm always continuing to think about the things that I could be doing differently and building my awareness. So with that, both self-care and support, while also having someone to challenge you on the side, which I really appreciate. And then I'm gonna have to kind of double stamp what Felicia said around listening. Sometimes our voices are so important and our voices need to be heard. And other times we need to recognize when we're the dominant identity in the space, and we just actually need to listen. And that doesn't mean that you're not valued. It just means that you're valuing other people over your own voice at that point. And that's a great place to be, recognizing that what other people have to say and feel is way more important than what you have to say at that point. And I think recognizing that and being aware of that is a huge step.
Amazing. A triple stamp on the listening. One of the first things I did when we shifted to an online teaching format was to really make some space at the beginning of the classes that I was doing to really hear what was on people's minds. and to really look for where the inequities are, which is what we're supposed to do in public health anyway, but really to intentionally look for how is this going to play out differently for folks, you know, trying to get ahead of that as opposed to just being reactive to it. And, you know, I don't know, I mean, one of the things that's obviously on so many of our minds right now is trying to figure out, without relying on, you know, folks with marginalized identities to tell me, trying to figure out how to be there for other people, especially with what happened in Minneapolis, you know, what happened in New York City, two places where I've actually lived. You know, I'm trying to figure out, and I'm doing a lot of vigorous reading of good writing on how to show up and how to be there and how to, because I honestly, I don't know. You know, I started writing a note to my class that from last spring to say like, you know, we've talked about these things and here it's happening again, but I really didn't know what to say and not sound like, you know, I want to make sure you remember that I'm a really woke, you know, supportive white lady. So, you know, I wound up writing nothing, which is not good either. So anyway, I would say listening, really actively looking for where the inequities are showing up in a crisis like this and trying to figure out, without adding to the burden, how to show up in an effective way.
For that, Candice, because that's very honest, right? And that's very vulnerable. People won't admit that because a lot of people might be like, go do this, and they'll just give you a list of things that you need to do. But like that individual internal work to be like, how do I do this without depending and relying on other folks? And while there are a lot of readings and videos out there, to have that one-on-one deep connection and actually make that active movement to say, okay, what policies am I pushing forth? What petitions am I signing? What virtual events am I going to make sure that I'm doing my own awareness? And what that looks like. I mean, one thing I'd say is like, it's always helpful for people to ask me like, what do you need in this moment? Because it allows for people not to assume what I might need. And then if I do want to talk to you, I might be like, I want to talk to you. And like, there's many moments, even during our staff meetings or team meetings, where people have reached out to me and be like, if you need anything, and like in the moment, maybe I don't want to talk to you, but it's nothing personal. I just need to be by myself. But maybe give me 30 minutes or 2 hours, and then I might get on a Zoom call with you, right? And so really figuring out what that means. Just your point about therapy, we can't do this work if we're not taking care of ourselves, especially if this is very deep and heavy work for those of us who are from these communities that are being impacted. So take care of yourselves if you are in these roles. And Felicia, I love how you just give us those 3 points and just be like, boom, boom, boom. Because honestly, if you, like efficient with it, right? Like if you're not listening and like paying attention, it defeats the purpose for even trying to do this work, right? Because you have to be able to know what's happening, to Candice's point, to be able to even write that email, to Jeff's point, to even be able to take care of yourself. So I appreciate all of your answers, your wisdom. We're going to switch gear now to the Q&A. So I haven't seen anyone take a sip of water or anything. So if you need to do that, please do so. As I pull up the Q&A, I put a little question in the chat box. So we shared things that we're doing, or the panelists share things that they're doing. I just want to remind us that we're a community. So as much as we're learning from people on here, please let's learn from each other. So if you want to share what you're doing, please feel free to do so. While you're doing that, the first question that got 10 votes, and we're going to go ahead and answer it. I want to remind the panelists that everyone does not have to answer every question, specifically because of the sake of time. But if you really want to say something, please do. So the first question is, what strategies have you used to develop active allies in a progressive, modern workplace? What strategies have you used to develop active allies in a progressive, modern workplace? Whoever wants to start us off, go ahead. I know you're like thinking.
I can start. I think something that's super important is providing spaces for employee resource groups or affinity groups. We call them affinity groups at City or Boston. We currently have a white affinity space and a people of color affinity space, and then a variety of other spaces that can pop up as needed. But I think that's a really good way for folks to be able to get what they need from folks who look like them or have a similar experience or identity. And it's also a place in particular, I think, for the white folks to be able to challenge each other in a way that takes the burden off of people of color who continually feel that burden. And so I think that's a great strategy to start kind of building what does it mean. So anytime we have affinity spaces, our white affinity spaces, always talking about like solutions and like, what does it mean for us to actually be in this? And what does it mean for us to dive in this? They're going through different workbooks and things together to kind of, be in this work in solidarity, which I think is super important. Some other strategies, we do a significant amount of training and just like open space and conversations for reflection, time for people to challenge themselves, challenge their thinking, own their own learning, understand the historical context to a lot of the racism and oppression that we see, and how it was built from hundreds of years ago and has been baked into our systems and our structures and the air that we breathe. And so I think that's a really great way to just challenge folks kind of mentally and academically as well. And then I think the other piece is, just open communication, just as much open communication and transparent communication as possible. And that's one that we're still kind of working on. So what does it mean to share information and share feedback in a way that folks are able to take it? And how are people then able to take that feedback and not get defensive, right? So kind of practicing all of that. We are by no means there yet, but I think it's conversations that we're starting to have.
Thank you so much for just for all those points. Hopefully some of you all are taking notes because that's super helpful. Anybody else want to add to that? No? All right. So the next question is, if companies are really moving towards a largely remote workforce, how has allyship been impacted? How can we support or improve DEI in the current environment?
I'll jump in for this one. So I think this is such an interesting time right now because there's so much change going on with this remote, virtual, not remote, what's going on. And I think we're all aware that a lot of companies are reacting and addressing this in a lot of different ways. Coming at this from the disability community, which I mentioned was one of my lenses earlier, there's sort of two ways that I've been thinking and talking about this, this exact question. The first thing is that now that we are moving towards, pretty much a vast majority of us at this point are engaged in virtual or remote work. And so thinking about why were there policies or barriers in place before that would not allow for remote work, which has been a really big issue in the disability community, where there are a lot of people who can't go into the office or have physical issues or can't access or have other accessibility concerns. And that's been a real challenge in the past, where there's even today, there's still job descriptions that say must be able to lift 20 pounds, which is one of those red flags as to one of those barriers for access into a job, where do you really need to lift 20 pounds if you're working in an office? Maybe not. And so we're starting to reconsider, what does it mean to work and how we work and who gets to work. And so I think that thinking about this with that hat of the ally on, challenging where you see these issues arise, and especially as companies are starting to move back towards potentially reopening or going back into office spaces, if you see that maybe some of these barriers are starting to come back down, challenge that and raise it up and talk about, why do we need certain things, or do we actually have to do things this way because we've seen that we've all been working and it's been okay. The other side of the lens that I want to talk about, the other side of the coin, is that there's actually been a lot of allyship within the disability community for their more able-bodied counterparts, where there's been a lot of people who've been saying, hey, welcome to the club. Have been doing this for many years. Let me tell you my tips and tricks. I can share with you how to work with constraints, how to work in a remote virtual environment. And so I think that's been really, really interesting and wonderful for me to see, where there's been sort of these dual approaches in terms of allyship. And just to wrap up, I want to share one more thought, which is that we talk a lot about allyship and allies as people who do have power and privilege, but you can be an ally and have mostly or predominantly marginalized or underrepresented identities. So just because you may be disabled or a person of color or whatever else it might be, doesn't mean that you also can't act as an ally. And I think this is a really great example of that.
Yes. Strong snaps. It's like really absolutely. Candice, Jess, anything else you'd add to that? All right, moving on. Thank you so much for that question. And we can still have that conversation after this if you all decide to stay afterwards. So the next question is, what advice do you have on starting the conversation around allyship in companies and getting folks comfortable stepping into that space for the first time?
can tell you one thing that really worked at BU School of Public Health, and Fatima had a hand in this. So we have an annual, theoretically now, sort of school retreat for staff and faculty to get together and, check in and talk about a bunch of different things. And a former student and colleague of mine organized a panel that Fatima appeared on. You were there, right? Yeah, you were. Just memory is all clouded now. Where it was a panel of recent former students of color to come and talk and tell stories essentially about what their experiences were as students at the BU School of Public Health. And I will say that it was a real game changer in the conversations that were happening, especially among faculty, but staff as well, because folks told their stories that were sometimes heartbreaking about what it's like to be in this historically white academic institution as a person of color, navigating that, and the experiences that they had that especially white professors didn't always see or hear or bear witness to. And it really, I would just say that the storytelling, the tool of storytelling itself was so powerful to get people motivated and want to change what was going on, because it was hearing the personal impact of having a system that is by nature inequitable and engineered to marginalize folks of color. It was a really powerful moment and really got a couple of different, DEI or whatever equity groups together. It actually motivated action. It was a really powerful moment. So I would say, hearing again on the theme of listening and the power of storytelling, and the importance of talking about your feelings and talking about how it felt to be in this position, not just this is unjust, which of course it is, but how you made someone feel, or how our institution, our classrooms, or whatever made someone feel, I think is one of the most powerful things we can do to bring people on board and get them to actually get with the program.
For that. And yeah, and to add to that in that moment, I think what's really key, if you are going to ask people genuinely about their experience because you intentionally want to make change, make sure you make that change. Because the worst thing that you can ever do is have someone be as vulnerable and be emotional about what has happened and relive that moment for you just to hear it and not do anything. And so if you're going to use that as a tool, which Candice mentioned, like things were done afterwards, make sure that you have something in place that you will be moving towards action that will create change within institutions or your community or wherever you are. Thanks for sharing that, Candice. Jess and Felicia, would you add anything to that?
Just one other quick thought. Oh.
Go ahead, you go first.
Thank you, Jess. I appreciate that. One quick thought, I'll keep it really brief, I promise, is that sometimes exclude in order to include, right? And so I think that can be a danger when we're thinking about starting the movement towards allyships, creating spaces within companies and getting people in this space, is that sometimes people get really excited, especially those who come from more privileged identities. They want to be there, they want to support, they want to show up, and don't understand that, especially around, I know the next question around ERGs, around affinity groups, around certain spaces, that sometimes they're built because not everyone should be part of the conversation or should be part of a space at all given points in time. And that realization can be really tricky and difficult for people who are new to this conversation and this learning journey. And sometimes that can be like a real barrier where they just have a bad experience because they just don't know enough or aren't willing to listen to understand why, and then sort of fall off that allyship path, if you will. So just to remember that just because you want to be an ally doesn't mean that you have to be involved in all of the conversations all the time, because part of that work is stepping back and allowing others to have that space or to have those conversations. And Jess, please.
Thank you.
Yeah, Felicia, I'm just going to add a little bit because what you were saying was like exactly what I was thinking, which is perfect. I think one thing that I want to add is there's most likely when you're having conversations around allyship, race, oppression, folks are going to be uncomfortable. And so like having some kind of norms set, like we have norms at CYB, one of which is lean into discomfort, like making sure that that's something that you continually remind people, like the purpose is not to be comfortable. And if you're comfortable, then you're being safe. And we need folks to take risks. And then I think the other thing is just making sure that there's a differentiation between equity and equality, right? So as Felicia's saying, Equality is everybody being in every conversation, everyone having the same thing. And like, that's not what folks need. And that's, I think, a pretty strong tenet of allyship. It's recognizing that other folks need something different than you. And you're empathizing with that and saying, okay, well, what can I give you? And what can I do to support you in this? Because you need something different than I do. And that's totally fine, right? Like, we're not all the same. We're not all, going to have equal experiences. And so we don't always need to be in the same conversations.
Perfect. Recognizing time, and I know we promised you all that we will try to get you back by 7. So we're going to quickly go through these questions. Candice, Felicia, Jess, you should have access to seeing these questions really quickly. One person can grab this. How do you go about starting ERGs in multiple locations? For those of you who might be like, what is ERGs? It's really affinity group. So if you're like in the nonprofit space and you never heard ERGs, that's what like a lot of corporations are using now. But who wants to give us an answer to that? Any thoughts?
Take this one. I think this is probably very pertinent, especially given the current situation where a lot of us are dealing with remote and different locations in any case. I think the first step is really to, again, sort of listen. What do people need? What communities within your organization are looking to have this space carved out? And then the second space is giving them that space, or the second step rather, is giving them that space. And that space could be virtual. It could be, if you're in an office, physical. But a lot of times also it involves tying in budget, honestly, to that activity. Because I think where a lot of times ERGs sort of fail is where executives and companies are like, great, we love this. Like we want to support Pride. We have all the swag. We do this. We have all these ERGs, but then they don't actually give them any power, any budget, any meaning. And so it's just an ERG or an affinity group in name only. And it's not really meant to get at what these spaces are for. So that's really what I would say is listen to see what people want. Just because you think that you might want to have a parent ERG doesn't mean that they want that. So what do people want? What communities need this? Secondly, give them the space. And then third, give them the support.
Yeah, support and resources is important because like we need that, right? Even if it's in a virtual space, right? So thanks for that. And look out for a webinar we're going to be doing in July when we talk about leading DEI work virtually, right? Because a lot of us will be in this space and DEI work is very sensitive. So how do you do that work? And we'll be talking a bit about ERGs. So sign up for our newsletter. That's a little plug if you have not. Next question. How important do you think it is for people in DEI leadership roles to show up with their minoritized identities? And then feel free, we can go to the next question if you want. How can executives generally act as allies without creating the perception they are supporting diversity to support their own ego career? So whichever one you want to answer, go.
Yeah, I think it's definitely important for people in DEI leadership roles to show up in their minoritized or non-dominant identities. But I also think it's important for white folks who are in leadership in particular, and if they're doing DEI work, to make sure that they are both recognizing that they're white and bringing on other white folks, right? Or, myself recognizing that I'm cisgender and straight and bringing along those other people, right? So I think it's also important to note the areas that we have privilege and are, have dominant identities, because all of that kind of compiles who we are as people. We can't necessarily leave certain pieces at the door, or some people are able to leave certain pieces at the door a little bit easier. So wanting to make sure that you're kind of your full vulnerable self as much as possible. I will also highlight, just answering the second question, I think it's really important for executives to do the work, right? And so I think it's really important for it to not just be like, as Felicia was saying, like, we're giving you, awesome, go ahead, lead these ERGs. It's important for you to be in those spaces. It's important for you to, build your own awareness. It's important for you to do the work yourself, because if you're bringing that vulnerable piece of yourself into the space, it's going to be really difficult for people to say, oh, that's just their own ego or career, right? So leaning into those conversations, leaning into those spaces, I think is super important.
To add to that second question about the executives, I think it's really important that people get honest. If you're in a position of power like that, get honest about what it is you're willing to give up in the name of doing this work. And self-assess. You don't even have to tell anybody. It can be your little secret in your diary, but ask yourself, what am I really trying to do here? Is it just performative, or am I really willing to give up power and to rearrange power? And be honest, because and even asking that question or even acknowledging that question requires some honesty. But yeah, self-assess and what are we willing to give up here? And what are we not?
Have any last thoughts? Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think this last question is so important because, let's be real, in a majority of organizations, we still see a very homogenous leadership where it tends to be white, older men. And so when we're talking about how can executives act as allies, I think really the first step is acknowledging, not just their own identities, but as I think, I forget who mentioned this, but sort of that historical, like, where does this come from? It's not just something that's popped up in the last year or two, but the deep rooted issues that we're dealing with that I think we're all super aware of, even in today's world. But the other thing too is that a lot of times when I've been talking to people who are in senior leadership positions who are these older white men, they're like, okay, well, I don't have underrepresented identities. I don't have marginalized identities. And so it's really hard to sometimes access and enter into that conversation. And so just think about, where are those moments to yourself where you felt excluded? It could be you joined a new school and no one sat with you at the lunch table. It doesn't have to be because of your race something happened, or because of your ability, or whatever it might be. Like, it can be those smaller moments, but you can still have that feeling and then use that as a way to sort of enter into the conversation. A lot of times people will enter in because they have a family member who's maybe has different abilities, or I've in the tech space, a lot of times executives come to this because they're like, oh, I had a daughter. Now, don't get me started on that because that's a whole other issue, because what about their wives and mothers and other women in their life? But I'll put a pin in that because we do not have the time to get into it right now. But that's another entry point for a lot of men. But it can also be, as a manager or as someone who works in a company, how have I supported my peers who are different than me? And so I really think that, it's still the reality that executives who support diversity don't always get benefited by this. Like, you don't get a bonus. You're not getting any points from the CEO for this. A lot of times it's extra work. And so really being intentional and not necessarily excited, but eager to learn and listen, and not just look at it as oh, I have to check this off the box kind of thing. So.
Awesome. Perfection. And even if it's not perfect, it is the perfect list of things to keep us going and keep doing this work, right? I'm so grateful and appreciative of each of your knowledge, your wisdom, and time that you spent with us today. To the general group that are still here, we started off like close to 60, we're at 43. Y'all are amazing, because like y'all might stay later and continue connecting. Two things I wanted to know about some of the questions that came up, because there's just certain themes. The first thing is you have to build trust, right? Even when people have perceptions about you, you have to realize this is coming from a place. It's not made up. No one's like hallucinating. Like, these are real. There are real reasons why people can't trust certain people, unfortunately, right? And I'm not saying it's a great thing. So in order for you to be able to show up as a co-conspirator, as an ally, as an accomplice, you have to build trust. That means working with people, communicating, not just doing work together, but also hanging out, right? That's the only way I can break down those walls, to recognize that you're actually here to see me. And the last thing I want to say is people need to recognize that whether they have privileged identities or not, that once every group that has been marginalized is free, then everyone else is free, right? And so in moments when people in the communities talk about being hurt or being harmed by certain policies, structures, or cultures, at some point other groups will also be harmed, right? And so I like to say this because people who have privileged identities are like, well, what do I have to gain from this? Everything. You have everything to gain from this, because in the moment where you step up and say that I'm going to show up for folks, that's the moment where things begin to change, not only for people who've been struggling and suffering, but also for you. Like, our systems can be so much better even for you, even if you think it's good for you right now. So those are my parting words. I, again, thank you. Stay on. We'll be on till 7:30. You can go back to those groups and keep chatting. Candice, Felicia, and Jess, if you want to put your social media stuff in the chat box, feel free to do so. You also have their LinkedIn's. Felicia is picky about who gets to connect with her, so good luck with that. But you can connect with these folks on LinkedIn. I'm sure they'll be happy to connect with you and email them to continue the conversation. Appreciate all of you. Y'all are amazing. I love the comments. Take good care of yourself. And with that said, any closing words, or do y'all feel like we can peace out? Peacing out? All right. Thank you all. Bye.